Hey everyone, I know it's been a little while since I uploaded. Like I mentioned before, my new studio is finally finished, and I also built a new PC. From now on, I'm going to have Minecraft, or maybe other games you guys suggest, playing in the background while I tell horror stories. I always kept the visuals simple because I didn't want to distract from the stories, but YouTube has been cracking down on low-effort slideshow content, and I want to keep making the channel as original as possible. I'll be starting a brand new Minecraft world just for these videos, so let me know what you want me to build. I'm not the best builder, but I think it'll be fun. I also have one more big thing I'm working on behind the scenes, but I'll share more about that when the time is right. Thanks so much for all the support, and I hope you enjoy the new style of videos. I grew up in a small town in northern Maine. It wasn't one of those postcard towns with tourists walking around during the summer. If someone asked where I grew up, I'd tell them the nearest larger town because nobody had ever heard of ours. My dad worked for the local paper mill. The shifts changed all the time, so there were weeks where he'd leave before sunrise and others where he wouldn't get home until close to midnight. My mom worked the front desk. Between the two of them, somebody was almost always home, but every now and then their schedules lined up in a way that left me alone for a few hours. Our house sat by itself on a narrow county road with only a few other houses spread out every couple hundred yards. Across the street there was nothing except woods. Behind the house was even more woods. It was actually a nice place to live. My friends and I built little forts back there, rode bikes down the dirt roads, and spent summers catching frogs in a creek that wasn't much more than ankle deep most of the year. If you've only lived in cities or suburbs, it's hard to explain how little light there can be in places like that. Once the porch light was off, the trees just blended together into one black wall. On cloudy nights, you couldn't even make out where the woods ended and the sky began. I spent a lot of evenings by myself without thinking much about it. My parents had a list of rules that never changed. Don't answer the door unless you know exactly who's there. Keep the doors locked. If somebody needs help, call one of them first instead of opening the door. Those rules felt more like habits than actual safety advice. Most of our neighbors knew each other anyway. If somebody stopped by, it was usually because they wanted to borrow a tool or drop something off. They almost always called first because cell service wasn't great, and everybody knew people appreciated a heads up before driving all the way out there. My parents were going to a dinner for one of my dad's coworkers who had just retired after decades at the mill. I wasn't interested in going because it sounded like a room full of adults talking about work while I sat there wishing I was home. They left around 6. My mom reminded me to microwave the leftovers if I got hungry. My dad pointed at the front door before leaving and gave the same reminder he always did. Keep it locked. I rolled my eyes because I'd heard it 1,000 times. I know. He laughed and told me they'd probably be back before 10. Once they left, I pretty much settled into the routine I always had whenever I got the house to myself. I heated up leftover, watched TV for a while, then went upstairs to my room. I think I was playing on my old Xbox with volume turned low, because I didn't want to miss hearing my parents pull into the driveway. Time moved slowly back then. Without social media constantly buzzing on my phone, an evening felt longer. I'd switch between games, music, and just staring out my bedroom window whenever I got bored. From that window, I could see most of the front yard and the gravel driveway leading to the road. It wasn't a perfect view because a couple of pine trees blocked part of it, but I could tell when a car pulled in. It had been completely quiet for most of the evening. Then I heard knocks. I knew someone had intentionally knocked instead of accidentally bumping the door. I walked over to my bedroom window because it overlooked the front entrance better than the peephole downstairs. I'm not even sure why I chose the window first. I'd gotten into the habit of checking who arrived before running downstairs. Standing on the porch was someone I had never seen before. He was wearing a dark gray hoodie with the hood pulled up. The porch light was on, but he had his head tilted downward. He was standing there. I was thinking he'd broken down somewhere because it wasn't impossible for people to get lost around there. GPS wasn't nearly as reliable back then, especially on the back roads. He knocked again. I stayed where I was, My parents had always been clear that if I didn't know the person outside, I wasn't supposed to answer. After waiting another minute or so, the man stepped off the porch instead of leaving. He slowly walked around the side of the house. I remember leaning toward the window trying to see where he had gone. From my angle, I could only watch him disappear past the corner of the garage. I stood there for another 20 or 30 seconds expecting him to come back into view from the other side, but he didn't. I wondered if he was looking for a house number or checking whether anyone was home. None of it really made sense. I heard footsteps outside again. A few moments later, he came back around the front of the house and walked onto the porch like he'd simply been taking a look around. That's when he finally spoke. His voice caught me off guard. It was unusually high, like he was forcing himself to sound like someone else. At first I thought there might be a woman standing outside until I looked again and saw the same person in the hoodie. He asked for some water and said he needed help, but the way he talked made it hard to understand individual words. He spoke quickly, his voice rising and falling in an odd way that didn't sound natural. I caught bits and pieces, but not enough to understand what he was actually trying to tell me. I stayed silent. He kept talking for another few seconds, like he expected somebody inside to answer. When nobody did, he stopped speaking. He simply stood there, facing the front door without moving. Then, instead of knocking again, he reached down and slowly turned the doorknob. I heard the latch click against the strike plate, and I thought I'd somehow forgotten to lock the front door. I remember feeling my stomach drop before I reminded myself that the deadbolt was always locked whenever my parents left. My dad was obsessive about checking it. The regular latch moved with the handle, but the deadbolt held. Whoever was outside knew immediately because he tried the handle a second time, a little harder, and it stopped in exactly the same place. He didn't pound on the door or yell. He just stood there. I was still upstairs looking down through my bedroom window, and even though I knew he probably couldn't see me standing back in the dark, I instinctively stepped away from the glass. After another few seconds, I heard the porch boards creak again. I heard slow footsteps moving away from the front entrance. They weren't hurried. If anything, they sounded casual, like someone walking around a yard they were familiar with. I stayed where I was for another minute because I didn't know what to do. I decided to call my parents. My mom answered, and I told her somebody I didn't recognize had been outside asking for help, that he sounded strange, and that he'd tried opening the front door after I ignored him. When I finished, she said, "Lock every door again anyway. Stay upstairs. We're leaving right now." I remember hearing chairs moving in the background and my dad asking what happened before the call ended. I walked through the upstairs hallway, checking every window I could reach. Most of them were already locked because we rarely opened them once it got cold outside. I don't know why I was checking them. I think I just wanted something to do besides stand there listening. My bedroom faced the driveway better than any other room, so I went back in there and carefully looked outside again. The porch was empty. The driveway was empty. Then my eyes moved farther down into the yard. The man was standing near one of the pine trees. He hadn't gone back toward the road. He had moved about halfway between the house and the ditch near the edge of the property. Because he was farther away from the porch light, I could barely make out details. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust. I realized I hadn't actually seen his face earlier. He was wearing something over it. Looked more like one of those black face coverings. It covered everything except his eyes. I also noticed he had gloves on. That stood out because while it was chilly outside, it wasn't cold enough that everyone was wearing heavy winter gear yet. The gloves looked dark, black, and fit tightly enough that I could tell they weren't bulky work gloves. The last thing I noticed was what looked like a small bag hanging behind one shoulder. It wasn't very big, maybe a sling bag or a small backpack. I couldn't tell from where I was standing, but I remember wondering why someone asking for water would be carrying a bag around our property at night. He was looking, right at my window. My room was dark, and I was standing few feet back from the glass. Maybe he was just looking toward the house in general. It didn't feel that way. It felt like he knew exactly where I was. I ducked down. After a few seconds, I slowly looked again, hoping he'd started walking away. He was still standing there. I backed away from the window completely, closed my bedroom door, and locked it. I called my parents again. This time my dad answered. Before I could say much, he told me they were only a couple of minutes away and asked if the man was still there. I told him I thought so. He said not to go downstairs for any reason. I looked out the window one more time. I couldn't see the man anywhere. A minute later, I saw headlights turning onto our road. My parents' SUV pulled into the driveway much faster than usual. Before the vehicle had even completely stopped, my dad was already getting out. I remember my mom yelling something after him because he hadn't waited for her. Nobody was there. After making sure everything was clear, he came inside and asked me to go through everything from the beginning. My dad walked around checking every window and every exterior door. He looked for footprints near the side of the house the next morning, but the ground was mostly gravel and packed dirt, so there wasn't much to find. They did contact the sheriff's office. Over the years, I've thought about that night more than I'd like to admit. If he genuinely needed help, why walk around the house before speaking? Why try the doorknob after nobody answered? Why wear gloves and a face covering when it wasn't cold? They never sat right with me. I'm in my 30s now, and I've lived in apartments, suburbs, and bigger cities where people knock on your door for all kinds of normal reasons. I don't automatically assume someone outside is dangerous, but I still don't open the door unless I'm expecting someone. That habit started because of that night. It was what I saw a few minutes later. When I looked out from the upstairs window, he was just standing there in the yard, still facing the house. He had gloves on, a mask covering his face, and he didn't move or say a single thing. I have no idea why he was there or what he had planned. After all this time, I don't think I want to know. I was 26 that summer, and for a couple of months I was staying at my dad's place outside of Somerset. It was just a decent piece of land with a small house, a couple of old barns, and enough pasture that my dad kept a handful of horses and a few cows. He'd lived there for years after my parents divorced, and by then it was just normal to everyone in the family that if you wanted to get away from town for a while, you'd stay with him. I had been living in Lexington before that, working. I'd burned through almost all my vacation time helping my mom after she'd had surgery earlier that year, and by the beginning of summer I was exhausted. My boss didn't mind if I took a few unpaid weeks because work had slowed down, so I packed a couple bags, threw them in my truck, and drove down to my dad's place with no real plan besides relaxing for a while. Life out there moved a lot slower than what I was used to. Most mornings started with coffee on the porch, while my dad listened to local radio stations that seemed to spend equal time talking about weather and high school sports. If he wasn't fixing something, he was planning to fix something. There was always a fence post leaning, a gate sticking, a tractor making a strange noise, or a water trough needing to be cleaned. Even if you woke up intending to do nothing, he'd eventually walk by and ask if you wanted to help him with something real quick, and somehow that always turned into 3 hours. I didn't mind it. Looking back, it was the longest stretch of my adult life where I wasn't constantly thinking about work. One thing I liked about staying there was that almost everyone knew everyone else. My dad had lived in Pulaski County long enough that every trip into town turned into 20-minute conversations in grocery store parking lots. We'd stop for gas, and he'd end up catching up with someone he'd graduated high school with 40 years earlier. Because of that, I ended up reconnecting with an old friend named Matt. We'd gone to the same high school for a couple years before my mom moved us closer to Lexington. We'd stayed in touch through Facebook every now and then. His place was about 40 minutes from my dad's house if you drove, but there were a bunch of county roads that cut through farmland and wooded areas where you could shave some time off depending on where you started. The roads out there all looked the same to me at first. Long stretches with no streetlights, mailboxes every few hundred feet, churches that looked like they'd been standing since the 60s, and woods that seemed to go on forever. Matt rented an old farmhouse with another guy named Aaron. It was the kind of place people in their 20s like, because rent was cheap and nobody cared if there was a grill sitting in the yard year-round. That whole summer blended together in my memory because the days were so similar. You always assume living somewhere rural feels isolated. It can, but not in the way movies show it. It's quiet. My dad's property sat near a heavily wooded area that stretched for miles. There were trails people used for hunting, but otherwise nobody really had much reason to be back there. I remember asking my dad one afternoon if anybody actually owned all of it. He said, "Different people own different pieces. Best thing to do is stay where you belong." Driving through that area after dark was always different than during the day. Your headlights only reached so far. It was a Friday toward the end of July, and Matt had texted me asking if I wanted to come over because he was smoking ribs and a couple other friends were coming by. My dad had gone to visit my aunt that afternoon, so I borrowed his old pickup instead of taking mine because it already had a nearly full tank of gas. Around 10, somebody started a small fire in one of those metal fire rings you can buy at hardware stores. We sat around it for another hour or two just talking. Eventually, people started heading home. The only reason I didn't leave with everyone else was because Matt asked if I wanted one more beer before I went. I wasn't driving far, and I ended up staying longer than I meant to, just because we got talking about old classmates and trying to remember what everyone was doing these days. By the time I looked at my phone again, it was a little after midnight. Normally, I would have just driven back. The problem was that one of the front tires on my dad's truck had been losing air all evening. Aaron noticed it before I did. We looked at it with flashlights and found a roofing nail buried in the tread. Matt had an air compressor, so we filled it back up, but it was obvious it wasn't going to stay inflated for very long. He offered to help put on the spare. The spare turned out to be almost completely flat, too. I was laughing because it seemed exactly like something my dad would accidentally do. He was the type of person who'd check everything except the one thing he'd actually need someday. Matt said I could just stay the night, but I knew my dad planned on getting up early Saturday morning because we were supposed to haul hay before it got too hot outside. I told Matt I'd just walk back. It sounds funny now, but it really didn't seem like a big deal at the time. From his place to my dad's property, most of the route followed quiet county roads. It wasn't a short walk, but I'd been outside all evening anyway, and the weather was nice. Matt even offered me a flashlight, but I turned it down because I had the flashlight on my phone if I needed it. I remember him saying, "Text me when you get back." I told him I would. Everything was exactly what you'd expect from walking in the country at night. There weren't many houses, and the ones I passed all had porch lights on. A couple dogs barked as I went by, then lost interest. There was enough moonlight that I barely needed my phone. The road eventually narrowed and curved toward the wooded stretch that sat between Matt's side of the county and where my dad lived. Walking through it was different, not because I thought something was going to happen, but because once I entered that stretch, there weren't any houses for quite a while. The trees grew close enough to the road that they blocked most of the moonlight, and there weren't any streetlights at all. I ended up taking my phone out more so I could occasionally check where I was than because I actually needed the flashlight. I had almost made it through the darkest part when I noticed something off to my right. I slowed down because I didn't want to accidentally startle whatever it was. A man stepped out of the trees. The first thing that registered wasn't that he was shirtless. It was how quietly he'd managed to get that close to the road. The woods along that stretch had a lot of brush, dead branches, and leaves on the ground, so even deer usually made enough noise that you could hear them moving before you saw them. He just sort of appeared between the trees and stepped onto the shoulder like he'd been standing there watching the road. He looked like he was somewhere in his 30s. He wasn't clean-shaven, and his hair was long enough that it covered part of his face. He looked thin, the kind of thin you get from spending a lot of time outside. He wasn't wearing shoes that I could see, just dark work pants. I wondered if he'd wrecked an ATV or gotten lost hunting, even though it obviously wasn't hunting season. As I walked past him, I gave the same little nod I'd probably give anybody else. Out there, people acknowledge each other, even if they don't know one another. He didn't nod back, he just watched me. I kept walking. I didn't immediately think I was in danger. The whole situation was strange, but there are plenty of odd people in rural areas for perfectly ordinary reasons. Somebody could have been camping. Somebody could have been drunk. Somebody could have been having an argument at home. I didn't know. After like 20 seconds, I heard footsteps behind me. I saw the man walking in the same direction I was, maybe 40 feet back. The road was empty in both directions, so I could hear his footsteps every few seconds whenever the gravel shifted under his feet. I walked another minute or so before it finally started bothering me enough that I decided to stop. I turned around and said, "Hey, you all right?" He stopped too. He was looking at me the same way he had when he first stepped out of the woods, just staring. I asked if he needed help or if he was trying to get somewhere. He finally said, "Just heading the same way." That was it. I remember standing there wondering if I was making the situation more awkward than it needed to be. If we were both going the same direction on the same road, there wasn't exactly anything either of us could do about it. So I shrugged and stepped off toward the shoulder. I said, "Go ahead." He started walking again and passed me without saying another word. That was when I noticed the scratches. They were all over him. Not little scratches like you'd get from walking through briars for 5 minutes. There were long red marks running across his chest, shoulders, and both arms, and the back of his pants. There were dark stains around one thigh and near the pocket. Even in the moonlight, I could tell they weren't just mud. They looked like dried blood. By then, he'd already moved ahead of me. I figured if he needed help badly enough, he probably would have said something when I asked. He stayed like 30 yards in front of me. The distance never really changed. It was an odd situation because I actually felt a little better with him in front of me instead of behind me. At least I could see where he was. The road curved slightly left, and both of us disappeared into one of the darker stretches where the trees came closer together. I was looking down for a second because the shoulder got uneven there. When I looked back up, he'd stopped walking. He was standing in the middle of the road with his back to me. I slowed down. He reached one hand toward the waistband of his pants. It was a blade. I couldn't tell you where he'd been carrying it. He pulled it free casually. Then he turned around. He just stood there facing me with the knife hanging at his side. There couldn't have been more than 40 feet between us. There wasn't any good reason for a shirtless man covered in scratches and what looked like blood to be standing in the middle of an empty county road holding a knife after midnight. I turned around. I just ran. I've never been a particularly fast runner, but fear does something to you. I wasn't paying attention to how tired I was or how far I'd already walked. I remember hearing my shoes sliding on loose gravel and thinking I was going to fall if I looked back. I made the mistake of looking anyway. He was running too. That image has stuck with me more than almost anything else. He wasn't running like somebody who'd suddenly gotten angry. He looked completely focused. He wasn't saying a word. He was coming after me. I could hear him behind me for part of it. Then I couldn't anymore. But I didn't trust myself enough to slow down just because the footsteps had stopped. I kept running until Matt's driveway came into view. His porch light was still on. I don't think I've ever been happier to see a light in my life. The front door flew open before I got to the porch. I managed to get out something about a guy with a knife following me. By then, Aaron had come outside too. Both of them immediately looked down the road. Nobody was there. That was the end of it. I stayed at Matt's house that night. This happened over 10 years ago. It was just another temporary job I picked up when I was doing property management work, and at the time I thought it would be one of the easiest paychecks I'd make all year. Back then I lived in North Carolina. I wasn't tied to one company. I bounced between caretaking jobs, rental inspections, vacation homes, and occasionally houses that owners left empty for months at a time. If somebody needed a place checked on while they were overseas or living in another state, there was a decent chance someone I knew would recommend me. Most assignments lasted a few days. It suited my personality. I've always been pretty comfortable being by myself. The job came through a guy I'd worked with before named Darren. He managed several vacation properties for wealthy owners who only visited a couple times a year. One afternoon he called and asked if I was available for about 2 weeks. The place is isolated, he said. That's the only downside. He said, no neighbors, no traffic, cell service is awful, but they pay well because nobody wants to stay there. That part should have caught my attention more than it did. The property sat in eastern Tennessee. Getting there took me most of a morning. The last stretch was almost entirely gravel roads winding through forest. When I finally reached the property, I understood why the owners liked it. The house itself was huge, easily the biggest private vacation home I'd ever looked after. Whoever built it obviously had money. It sat on several acres, with woods wrapping almost completely around it. The owners lived in Atlanta most of the year. According to Darren, they used the place for holidays, family reunions, birthdays, and company parties. Darren met me there the first day to hand over the keys. The job was exactly what I'd expected. People in town were friendly enough. I ate breakfast twice at the same diner, and by the second visit, the waitress remembered what I ordered. That's the kind of place it was. The afternoons usually went by slowly. The woods were everywhere, just endless trees. Oak, pine, hickory. There weren't any hiking trails on the property that I knew of, although I found deer paths here and there while walking the fence line. People who haven't spent time in really rural areas think the country is full of nature sounds all night, but that's not always true. The backyard became my favorite place once the sun started going down. There was enough open space that I could actually get 1 or 2 bars of cell service if I stood near the back fence. It was enough to send texts or scroll through news headlines while smoking a cigarette after dinner. I've smoked on and off for years. I know I should quit. Back then I definitely smoked more than I do now, and those evenings became part of my routine. I'd stand in roughly the same spot every night, because moving even 20 feet usually meant losing signal again. One evening, I was standing back there just after dark checking messages from my brother. The sky still had a little blue left over the trees. I heard someone crying. The sound carried through the trees in a weird way that made it difficult to tell where it was coming from. It sounded like a woman. I looked at my phone thinking I had accidentally opened a video without noticing, but there was nothing playing. Then it stopped. I remember waiting because I figured I'd hear voices after that, or maybe a vehicle somewhere. Nothing. The woods were quiet again. I finished my cigarette early, locked the back door, and spent the rest of the evening inside watching downloaded movies. The next morning, sunlight has a way of making you question things that seemed strange the night before. While checking the property, I even walked closer to the tree line where I thought the sound might have come from. No campsites, no trash, just woods. For the next couple of nights, I settled back into the same routine. I'd head out behind the house because that little patch near the fence was still the only place my phone consistently picked up a signal. A few evenings later, I was standing in the same spot again, scrolling through messages while finishing a cigarette. It was darker than the first night. The moon was out, but the tree line was mostly just one long black wall beyond the yard. I remember being irritated because a text from Darren wouldn't send. I had my phone held up over my head trying to squeeze out enough signal when I heard a noise from somewhere in the woods. This one wasn't crying. It was hard to describe then, and it's still hard now. The closest comparison I can make is that it sounded like some kind of animal making a drawn-out scream. It didn't sound like anything I'd heard before. It was the quality of it that bothered me. It started low, climbed into something almost human for a second, then dropped off again. I lowered my phone and just listened. About 20 seconds later, I heard it again. I lit another cigarette instead of going back inside. I probably stood there another 5 or 6 minutes after that, mostly looking down at my phone while waiting for messages to load. Then I glanced toward the trees. I didn't understand what I was looking at. There was something pale near the ground, like 50 yards into the woods. Because of the distance and the low light, I couldn't tell if it was a large rock catching moonlight, a fallen log, or somebody wearing light-colored clothing. I kept staring, trying to make sense of it. Eventually, I realized what had caught my attention. It looked like long, dark hair hanging forward. The shape itself was low to the ground. I wondered if someone was sitting with their knees pulled up. Then it looked like they might be on their hands and knees instead. Even now, I couldn't tell you which it was. It wasn't close enough for details, just close enough that I knew it didn't belong there. If you'd asked me then whether I was looking at a person, I don't know what I would have said. It looked human enough that I couldn't ignore it, but at the same time, nothing about seeing someone out there made any sense. The property was gated. The driveway was over a quarter-mile long, and I'd been all over those woods during the day. There weren't any campsites or trails that I knew about, and if somebody had wandered onto the property, they would have had to walk a long way to get there. The shape never stood up. It just stayed low to the ground. It moved. It wasn't a stump. The movement was slow, like someone shifting their weight. I couldn't tell if it leaned forward or if it adjusted the way it was sitting, but that little bit of motion was enough to make every reasonable explanation I'd come up with disappear. My first thought was that someone might be hurt. The second thought was that maybe they weren't hurt at all, and that I had no business walking into unfamiliar woods after dark by myself. Those two ideas fought with each other for a few seconds. I even took a couple of steps toward the tree line before stopping. The more I looked, the less I liked the idea. I realized that if it really was someone needing help, they would have almost certainly called out once they saw another person standing in an open yard. Instead, there wasn't a sound. The house suddenly felt very far behind me. Without taking my eyes off the trees, I backed toward the patio. When I reached the edge of the patio, I glanced down for a second because my phone vibrated in my hand. It was just Darren replying to a message I'd sent earlier that afternoon. When I looked back toward the woods, I couldn't immediately find the spot again. That lasted 2 or 3 seconds. I scanned the tree line, trying to remember exactly where I'd been looking. Then I found it. Or at least I think I did. Whatever had been there seemed closer to the edge of the woods. I could tell it wasn't in exactly the same place. I turned around and walked as fast as I could to the back door. I got inside, locked the door, checked the windows, and ended up standing in the kitchen. I kept replaying what I'd seen, and every time I did, I questioned myself a little more. I looked out one of the upstairs windows later that night, but from that angle, all I could see were the tops of the trees and darkness beyond them. I eventually fell asleep sometime around dawn. When I woke up, at first I thought I'd just slept badly, but after sitting up, I realized I was actually sick. I had a pounding headache, my whole body ached, and I was shivering even though it wasn't cold inside the house. I don't know whether it was connected to stress or if I'd simply caught a virus while I was already staying out there. Logically, it was probably the second one, but at the time everything felt connected because of how the night had gone. I stayed in bed for several hours hoping I'd feel better. Instead, I started feeling worse. By early afternoon, I finally drove into town. The drive itself is still a blur because I felt miserable. I stopped at the pharmacy, bought fever medicine, sports drinks, soup, and whatever else looked useful. The pharmacist asked if I'd been around anyone who was sick. I laughed and told him I hadn't been around anybody. That was mostly true. While I was there, I almost mentioned what I'd seen the night before, but I didn't. After taking some medicine, I sat in the parking lot for a while before driving back. I considered calling Darren and telling him I needed somebody else to cover the property. The problem was that there really wasn't anyone available on short notice, and I knew the owners were expected back in less than a week. The fever also made me think I was probably just letting myself get worked up over nothing. So I went back. The whole drive-in, I kept telling myself that I'd look at the area during daylight and finally settle it. Once I got back to the house, I parked and walked around to the backyard immediately. It was bright outside, clear sky, no shadows hiding anything. I walked toward the tree line until I reached roughly where I'd been standing the night before. Then I tried lining up where I'd seen the figure. I couldn't figure it out. Everything looked ordinary. Leaves, brush, young trees, dead branches. I walked a little farther along the edge until the angle finally matched what I'd remembered. That's when I saw the stones. They weren't obvious unless you were looking from that direction. Several old gravestones were sticking up among the trees. Most of them leaned at odd angles, and a couple looked broken in half. They were covered with moss and surrounded by brush, which was probably why I'd completely missed them during my walks around the property. I walked a little closer, though I stayed outside the actual wooded area. From where I stood, I could count 6 or 7 markers. There could have been more hidden behind the trees. They looked old, really old. The writing on the nearest one had worn away enough that I couldn't read it from where I was standing. I realized the place I'd been staring at the night before wasn't just random woods. There had been an old cemetery there the entire time without me knowing it. I stood there for a minute, trying to remember if Darren had ever mentioned anything like that. He hadn't. For the remaining days, I completely changed my routine. I stopped going outside after dark unless I absolutely had to. When the owners arrived near the end of the second week, I handed everything over, packed my truck, and drove home. I don't think I mentioned any of it to anyone besides my brother. Even if it had been a real woman, that explanation creates a different set of questions that I still can't answer. Why was she out there? Why didn't she respond? How did she get onto a gated property miles from town? I never accepted another overnight job at that property, even though Darren asked a couple more times over the following years.